when you think about, this conservative objection to wokeness, or whatever they're talking about when they talk about wokeness, which is often confusing to me because, like, all right, so there's this like prehistory of like, there's a certain kind of like black radical usage of the word woke in like the 90s that, I think like has largely been forgotten by people of all races. But like more recently, it always, like, up until about a year ago, I thought I knew what woke meant. And like, I still sometimes do, like it's very speaker dependent and context dependent, because like usually what I thought that meant was like that you have like a certain kind of rhetorical posturing about social justice that tends to be very disconnected from any kind of analysis of material conditions, and tends to be very focused on what language people use and policing individual morality and stuff like that. In which case, like, yeah, okay, that sucks. But now it sort of seems like conservatives, your James Lindsay's and for that matter, your Ted Cruz's, just sort of use it to mean stuff they don't like in general.
Yeah. Well, it's not the first time that's happened, right? We can all remember back in what seems like decades ago, but really 25 years, postmodern neo-Marxism was the neologism that was just creeping up everywhere. That never really seemed to catch on. Maybe there are too many syllables. So just labeling everything woke at least has a kind of elegance to it in a simplified sense, I guess.
Yeah, woke is the easiest to appropriate or to just deploy because it's even shorter than critical race theory, right? But I think the point you're making, Matt, which I entirely agree with, is that it's the same. It's literally the same thing that you've been hearing from the right for 40 plus years. Just the terminology has changed, but it's weird because Ben, like you were saying, woke. I don't know if this, when we want to decide where it started, but my sense of it is similar to yours, that it's almost like, from a left perspective, liberal identity politics is just pure, like this empty sort of performative wokeness, right? But clearly that's not the way in which it's being, it's been, again, appropriated or used by my favorite thing though. Every time I hear still woke, like years later, it might be less than a year later, actually. I think it was like one of the first calls that Trump did on like Fox News after, he'd gone after the insurrection. He'd been, in hiding for however long till he actually started giving public interviews. And then the first thing was on Fox, and he said something like, "Oh, they were asking him about like Biden's first 100 days or something," and he said something like, "When China sees woke, we're so." I just want to write a book titled "When China Sees Woke" because it's a perfect articulation of Trump's word salad.
People have been doing this for a very long time. I mean, if you really wanted to go back, you could read Bill Buckley's "God and Man" at Yale, which, to be fair, is a much better monograph than 90% of the "I'm a conservative and I'm not allowed to speak on campus" tracks, which have basically become a minor literature at this point. And a rite of passage for young conservative intellectuals. And
it's interesting because that's kind of the opposite of the point of God and Man at Yale, right? Because like God and Man at Yale is before they started pretending to care about free speech. It's like that, like the point of the point of the polemic was like explicitly pro censorship. That like the entire argument he's making in that book, which I agree, like just as a piece of writing, is like 10,000 times better than any conservative book that's coming out now. But like, I actually read that shortly after reading the Ben Shapiro Right Side of History book, and like it was such a, it's like, oh, this is so nice, like, but like the point of the book, the argument he's making is that Yale should be firing professors for being socialists or atheists.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what I was getting at was Russ's point that even then, he basically characterized anybody who even taught moderate forms of Keynesian intervention as left, right? So basically anybody who wasn't a member of the Republican Country Club was going too far and should be censored or at least reprimanded in the way that Ben was talking about. But yeah, no, 100%. I mean, that book is refreshingly candid on that point, where he's overtly political, and he basically says that Yale should just fire the professors who teach, or at least very staunchly reprimand the professors who teach anything that I think is inappropriate. and all the rest who teach the things that I do think are appropriate should just be let off scot-free. Now, and I'm sure we'll get into this, there's a lot more wishy-washy kind of opinions about this, where 1 minute, we'll be talking about defending free speech and how leftists are destroying it, and then on the other, we'll be talking about why it's not really censorship if somebody's talking about something like critical race theory or advocating for anti-Israeli policies, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's some really interesting recent examples. Not all of which I should say. I mean, involve people who I like or whose views I like, but like I still think it's like super interesting to look at the reversals on it, right? There's this philosophy professor Stephen Kirschner. You guys know who this is?
I've heard of this case. I haven't looked into it yet,
but
okay. So Stephen Kirschner is a philosophy professor at SUNY Fredonia, and he's like, his whole thing is that like he'll take whatever views people find like most abhorrent and like try to like do this like, well, can you justify that? Maybe we should believe that, and some of it's like kind of trolly and silly, and some of it is actually kind of interesting. He makes good points, and some of it is like creepy in the like conclusions he goes to. But I do find it super interesting the way that this has played out in the last few days, which is that so there's this interview he did with Thaddeus Russell in December 2020, right? So it was 14 months ago, and it's like a reasonably popular podcast. Like presumably thousands of people have listened to it over the course of the 14 months. And in there, they talked about a few things. They talked, like all of which Kirschner has written about. Like the first one, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I listened to a decent chunk of it, including the part that everybody's freaking out about. So the first chunk was the stuff that Kirschner has written about why the views of anti-abortionists are incoherent, and if they really believed this, they'd be like shooting up clinics all the time, and like not say that that's wrong, because if you really believed this was mass murder, then like how could you explain why you wouldn't do that? And I actually think like in that part, like he kind of got them on a lot of like weird contradictions. Yeah, the third part, which I thought was just whatever. I mean, I guess I agree, although it's a weird thing to talk about. Was just kind of like he'd written something about why we actually shouldn't be grateful to veterans. Like that's that's a very Kirschner
he was
topic.
just looking to get somebody riled up with that one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's almost you might as well just sit there in an American context and be like, here's why we shouldn't love the dog. Like,
yeah. No,
yeah,
totally.
yeah. I would steer away from. I don't have strong thoughts on it, but I would probably steer away from that regard.
Yeah, no, of course.
I wouldn't come hot out of the gate with that one,
because it's like such a weird fight to pick, right? And then in between those two, there was. I mean, I'm actually saving the like the most extreme one. So in between those two, there was this whole thing about age of consent laws, and like is it what do you really mean when when you say that people aren't capable of consent, and does this really make sense, and like there, it's basically my take on the discussion was that it was a couple of libertarians doing what libertarians do, which is like be like weirdly naive about how power works, because they just like think of everything in terms of binary questions about like contractual voluntariness, right? So it's like not like what's actually going on there philosophically is not like a particularly remarkable coming from people like this, but of course it's like super shocking in its like application to this instance, right? So 14 months after the interview, there's this like really popular conservative Twitter account called Libs of TikTok. You guys see this?
Okay.
Yeah. So they like somehow stumbled on like kind of the worst minute of the age of consent part, and started this like giant freak out, which has included like So SUNY Fredonia has apparently, they're investigating Kirschner, and they've put him on some sort of like restriction where he's only going to be engaged in duties that are off campus, which is weird too, because like if it's like they think he's a pedophile because of like the age of consent stuff, I mean presumably everybody who's on campus is not a child almost by definition, but whatever. Like and the interesting thing to me is that this has been like entirely, like I've seen like almost no leftists or even liberals like freaking out about this. I mean, like it's been like almost 100% like conservatives doing it, and like anti-woke conservatives doing it, like James Lindsay, for example, who was going to co-teach this class with Thaddeus Russell, and like he announced that he was like not going to do that, because of this interview, from over a year ago, and it's all like just like this constant stream of conservatives saying that like both of them should be fed into wood chippers or hanged or things like that, and it's just kind of like, okay,
we used to be a good moral country, and the only way to bring us back to this idyllic golden age is to just throw philosophy professors into wood chippers and watch the blood come out, just like it's a fucking Fargo movie. That's the only way. We got to wood chipper our way back to the moral majority, baby.
Wait, so let me. I mean, it'd be entertaining at least. But
yeah.
Okay. Wait, let me just imagine. It's like I honestly haven't heard anything about this. So let me get this.
Well, straight. Yeah, you probably haven't heard anything about it because it's been like kind of entirely confined to the right.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so, that's why. Like so I haven't really seen anybody who's left of center. I'm sure there are a few people, but I haven't seen anybody getting in on this.
It's not okay. So it's not like an allegation was made. It's just that this a clip from this interview resurfaced.
Yeah,
and that's the only. And the right is freaking out at him because he's contesting or trying to complicate the notion of consent, or
yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I can see why that would be a good kind of issue for them to mobilize around, though. Because
nice QAnon adjacency there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you separate it from its context where you might be having a serious discussion about these kind of issues, it would just be a good way to try to peck at liberals and social libertarians by saying, look, they support pedophilia or something. But
no, I think that's exactly, it. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, I mean, in terms of this exercise, I agree that there is something trollish about asking these kinds of questions. And I don't imagine that all of them are intended all that seriously. I mean, every now and then you get undergraduates who will do that, right?
Sure.
Just write a provocative essay trying to defend the virtually indefensible, just to see if they can get a rise out of you, or as an intellectual exercise. Saying that, I do sometimes think that these kind of enterprises can be interesting, intellectually, fruitful. So, for instance, I read a book back in the day called "Is Eating People Wrong?" Which was a legal text on the history of court cases related to cannibalism. And one of the things that was brought up in this book is that many times in court, people had difficulty for actually arguing for why cannibalism is wrong, particularly if the people were already dead, because there was just such a visceral response that this is bad in some way, shape, or form. That was actually hard to argue for what made it bad. And so you had all these lawyers who weren't exactly all that philosophically adept trying to come up with arguments for what made cannibalism bad. And at the end, the author laid out a defense for why he thinks cannibalism is wrong, which, by the way, it is. Yes, I agree. I'm not trying to imply that we should eat each other. But, I was sitting there and I'm like, look, I don't know that anything lives or dies by this debate, but it's certainly an interesting intellectual enterprise to go through thinking why it is that something we know to be bad or we assume to be bad is actually bad. And
wait. At what point is it? Like at some point, it's got to be okay, right? What's the cutoff? A week after death? 3 days?
Yeah,
if we're in like an alive situation, how long do I have to? What's the requisite amount of time before I can eat somebody?
When the corpse is stealing, then it becomes okay. Or sorry, steaming, then it becomes okay. Okay. No, but I mean, a lot of these cases involve sailors who are lost at sea, and they would do the classical thing where 3 of them were on a boat. One person needs to die in order to save the rest. Is it okay to axe him at that point if you draw straws and then consume his body, right? And these were the little cases, right? It's not like this was a hypothetical scenario. And courts would just have to sometimes sit there and be like, well, this is an intriguing case. We're not really sure how to even think through these questions. A lot of times what ended up happening was the court would say, you were wrong to do this. But if you did it for your survival and you had no other option, we're not going to really punish you for it. We're just going to say, that's pretty fucked up, and please just steer clear of normal people from now on, and don't be talking about this at the bar, right? But the argument at the end for why cannibalism is wrong, because it impugns this kind of Kantian notion of dignity by distorting the body. It's a nice little argument that kind of ties everything up. But the point of this whole thing is that I do think that these enterprises can be interesting beyond just having a kind of faddish or trollish appeal. Because, I mean, I learned something.
Yeah, no, totally. I actually used to do that at the first day of ethics classes. I would ask people to raise their hand if they thought that cannibalism was wrong, and everybody did. Like, this is actually one I would do. And then I would like ask them to explain to me why it was wrong.
Yeah, exactly, right?
And there'd be, it's moral dumbfounding is what that's called. I totally agree. I think there is some, like some of them, like I think Kirschner like has this article that's like in defense of why it's like okay to have it's like called like in defense of Asian romantic preferences. It's like okay, but like, and again, I think he actually does, at least some of these things. It's a little unclear to me with the age of consent stuff, like what he actually, like I think some of his comments, like there's probably like a utilitarian case for this, and like I don't, it's a little unclear what his actual conclusion is, but like there are, I think, some of it. I mean, this, like he's kind of a, libertarian weirdo. Like he definitely has like actual conclusions on some of the stuff that I don't like. But I totally think there's some value to that. I mean, I think that's presumably one of the things that philosophy is good for.
Yeah.
Like part of its social value is that it, getting people to like have to really think through things that like everybody just accepts as obvious, because, every once in a while, like probably not these ones we've been talking about, but like every once in a while, something that everybody thinks is just obvious is actually like really importantly, wrong. Right. I mean, like if you're, and I would rather have norms about this that like let people like, especially like, I mean, people will make these like harm arguments and stuff. It's like, okay, I don't know, dude. I think you're overestimating like the actual impact on society and lawmakers of like, what philosophy professors do, for better or worse there. Right. Like, I don't think, like, I don't see a lot of like, congressmen like rushing to like introduce legislation to legalize pedophilia, because of something that like a philosophy professor said on a podcast about how it's actually like, a lot harder to figure out what we mean by consent, than, meaningful consent, than we think it is. Like, but I do think there's some social value in having people ask stuff like this. And I guess like to tie it back into what we're talking about, like, I just find it kind of amazing that like sometime that there's this constant switch around, right? That is the objection to academic wokeness that universities are conformity factories where, you're not allowed to dissent from what people, from like the consensus, or is the objection that like, depraved sickos are allowed to have jobs and, and aren't, fired and fed into wood chippers like they should be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the political right has really struggled to reconcile these two competing tendencies. And I think you've never seen a more spectacular example of it than now, including in this article, because, of course, there's so much animosity towards things like critical race theory. And there's now just this nationwide, transnational effort to ban it, because there were some efforts in this part in Canada also, right? And that's highly inconsistent, of course, with the claim that universities are just hotbeds of, censorship and homogeneity, and they're not allowing the expression of dissenting opinions, since of course you can't really hold to the idea that that's bad while at the same time trying to ban books from people you dislike. Another good example would be the hoopla over Mouse that came out recently. Great graphic novel, by the way. If people haven't read it, they should read Mouse. Definitely a piece of graphic art that like rises to the level of like a piece of like genuine literary art. But honestly, I would be lying if I said that I think that they care all that much about it, right? For some of the intellectuals, I do think this would be a problem. But for your average pundit on the political right, the notion that there would be some kind of inconsistency in saying I want A one day and I want B the next day just wouldn't trouble them all that much. And for that matter, I don't think it would trouble many members of their audience all that much either. So they'll probably just waffle out by saying things like, well, some kinds of speech should be heard and others shouldn't. And the ones that should be heard are the forms of speech that I agree with, and the ones that should be banned are the ones that I happen to think are grotesque or distort American history or unpatriotic, right? Or what does the New Hampshire requirement for teachers now. You're not allowed to teach treasonous things about the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, sorry, Russ.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, the New Hampshire law. What I thought was funny about this is that they had already apparently some like 1950s relic that was still on the books saying that you couldn't you couldn't like advocate communism as a teacher in Vermont, but part of the anti-CRT bill edits that line to include communism, socialism, or Marxism to make sure that they're covered all their bases. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.